In less than a week, commanders reshaped the Middle East. The war began before anyone fired a shot. It began in the mathematics of fuel consumption and flight times, in the careful study of Soviet training manuals, in the meticulous cataloging of every Egyptian MiG-21 and every Jordanian Hawker Hunter. It began in the mind of a man with one eye, who understood that in modern warfare, the side that strikes second often doesn't get a chance to strike at all. Moshe Dayan stood at the window of his office in Tel Aviv on the evening of June 4, 1967, watching the Mediterranean darken from blue to black. He had been defense minister for exactly 3 weeks, appointed during a crisis that had been building like a thunderhead since President Nasser of Egypt ordered UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai Peninsula in mid-May. The newspapers were calling it the waiting period, those 3 weeks of mounting tension when Israel's citizen soldiers were mobilized but not deployed, when the economy ground nearly to a halt, when every household held its breath, wondering if this time the threats from Cairo and Damascus would materialize into something worse than words. Dayan was 52 years old, a Sabra born in the first kibbutz Degania, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The black eye patch he wore had become his signature, a reminder of the Vichy French sniper bullet that had struck him during the invasion of Syria in 1941 when he'd been scouting ahead with Australian forces. That injury had ended his combat service in World War II, but had somehow enhanced his mystique, made him look like a warrior from another age, biblical almost. Though everything about his approach to warfare was relentlessly modern, he turned from the window and looked at the maps spread across the table. Red arrows marked Egyptian positions, blue circles showed Israeli forces. The Egyptians had moved 7 divisions into the Sinai, nearly 100,000 men, along with 1,000 tanks. Soviet advisors had helped them build formidable defensive positions at strategic choke points. In the north, Syrian forces commanded the Golan Heights, using the high ground to shell Israeli settlements in the valley below. To the east, Jordan's Arab Legion, perhaps the best-trained Arab force, held the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Iraq had sent troops, Saudi Arabia and Algeria had made promises. On paper, the combined Arab forces outnumbered Israelis' hastily mobilized reserves by staggering margins. But Dayan had learned long ago that wars were not won on paper. They were won by men who understood that the enemy's plan was just as important as your plan, maybe more so. Because if you could disrupt it completely in the first hours, if you could blind and paralyze your opponent before he could coordinate his superior numbers, then the math changed entirely. He picked up the phone and called Southern Command. "Tell Yafi and Sharon we go at dawn. Execute Operation Focus exactly as planned." In the operations room of the Egyptian Air Force headquarters outside Cairo, Air Marshal Sidki Mahmoud was reviewing the morning patrol schedules. It was early, just after 7 a.m. on June 5, 1967, and the first flights had already departed, sweeping over the Sinai to show presence, to remind the Israelis that Egypt's air umbrella remained intact. Mahmoud was confident in his force. The Soviet Union had supplied Egypt with modern aircraft, MiG-21 interceptors that could outfly anything the Israelis possessed, and Tupolev bombers capable of striking deep into Israeli territory. His pilots had trained in Moscow, learned Soviet tactics. True, some of the training had been rushed, and yes, there had been problems with maintenance and coordination, but numbers mattered, and Egypt had the numbers. The radar stations were showing normal activity, nothing unusual. The morning sun was climbing higher over the desert, and soon it would be time for the command staff to break for breakfast. Mahmoud lit a cigarette and thought about the victory parade they would hold in Tel Aviv after the war. President Nasser had promised it would be swift, that the combined Arab armies would crush the Zionist entity within days, perhaps a week at most. The rhetoric had been building for years, ever since the humiliation of the 1956 Suez Crisis, when Israel, Britain, and France had invaded but been forced to withdraw under international pressure. This time would be different. This time there would be no Western intervention. This time the Arab world stood united. At precisely 7:45 a.m. Cairo time, 8:45 a.m. in Israel, the first wave of Israeli aircraft crossed into Egyptian airspace, flying so low that shepherds in the Sinai could have reached up and touched their wings. They came in groups of 4, Dassault Mirages and Mystères.
their French-built engines screaming as they hugged the contours of the desert, staying below radar coverage, navigating by visual landmarks in split-second timing. The pilots had memorized their routes, knew every wadi and ridge, had practiced the approach until they could fly it in their sleep. The 11 Egyptian air bases in the Sinai and Nile Delta had been chosen with surgical precision. Israeli intelligence had spent years mapping them, photographing them, studying the routines of their personnel. They knew that Egyptian pilots typically flew their early patrols and then returned to base around 8:30 a.m. They knew that Soviet doctrine called for massing aircraft in neat rows on tarmac areas, which made maintenance easier but created target-rich environments. They knew that most Egyptian radar installations were oriented eastward towards Israel, and that flying in from the west over the Mediterranean would exploit a critical blind spot. The first bombs fell on Bir Gavgafa Air Base at exactly 8:45 a.m. The Israelis had developed special munitions for this operation, French-designed runway cratering bombs with delayed action fuses that would explode after burying themselves deep in the concrete, creating craters that would take days to repair. Mixed with these were cluster bombs and conventional explosives aimed at the neat rows of parked aircraft. Air Marshal Mahmoud was finishing his cigarette when the phone began to ring. Then another phone, then all of them at once. The voices on the other end were panicked, shouting about explosions, about aircraft on fire, about runways destroyed. Within minutes, reports were flooding in from every airbase across Egypt. The raids were simultaneous, coordinated with impossible precision. Mahmoud stared at the map on the wall, watching as pins marking destroyed aircraft multiplied like a plague spreading across the country. The second wave of Israeli aircraft arrived 10 minutes later, then a third wave, then a fourth. The Israeli Air Force had committed nearly its entire combat strength to this opening strike, holding back only 12 aircraft to defend Israeli airspace. It was an extraordinary gamble, predicated on the belief that if the Egyptian Air Force could be destroyed in the first hours, if you could blind and paralyze your opponent before he could coordinate his superior numbers, then the math changed entirely. He picked up the phone and called Southern Command. "Tell Yafi and Sharon we go at dawn. Execute Operation Focus exactly as planned." In Amman, King Hussein of Jordan faced an agonizing choice. He was receiving conflicting reports from Cairo. Egyptian radio was broadcasting claims of massive victories, of Israeli aircraft shot down, of Egyptian forces advancing into Israeli territory. But Hussein had his own intelligence sources, and they were telling him something very different. His military advisors were urging caution, suggesting that Jordan should wait, should verify what actually happening before committing Jordanian forces.
But Hussein was bound by agreements, by the promises of Arab unity that had been made with such fervor in the weeks leading up to this moment. On May 30th, he had flown to Cairo and signed a mutual defense pact with Nasser, placing Jordanian forces under Egyptian command. The pressure from his own population was intense. In the streets of Amman and Jerusalem, Palestinians were demanding action, demanding that Jordan join the fight to liberate Palestine. To hold back now, when Egypt claimed to be winning, when the moment seemed at hand, would be political suicide. At 11 a.m., Jordanian artillery began shelling West Jerusalem and Israeli positions along the 1949 armistice line. Jordanian infantry moved to take Government House, the UN headquarters situated on a hill between Israeli and Jordanian-controlled territory. The die was cast. Jordan had entered the war. In the Israeli cabinet room, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol received the news of the Jordanian attack with grim satisfaction mixed with genuine regret. Israel had sent messages to King Hussein through UN channels, promising that if Jordan stayed out of the fighting, Israel would not attack Jordanian positions. But now that promise was void. Now the West Bank, including East Jerusalem with its old city and holy sites, had become a legitimate military target. Dayan was already moving. He had anticipated this possibility, had units positioned and ready. The Central Command, under General Uzi Narkis, received orders to prepare for urban combat in Jerusalem. In the north, forces under the command of Brigadier General Elad Peled moved to cut off the Jordanian salient at Jenin. The objective was not just to repel the Jordanian attack, but to fundamentally alter the strategic geography of the region. In East Jerusalem, Jordanian soldiers of the Arab Legion took positions in the ancient stone buildings of the Old City. They were well-trained troops, many of them veterans, and they knew every alley and rooftop in the labyrinth of the Old City. The commander of the Jordanian forces in Jerusalem, Brigadier Atta Ali, understood that defending the city would be brutally difficult, that urban warfare favored the defender, but that Israeli firepower would eventually tell. Still, he believed that if they could hold long enough, if international pressure could be brought to bear, if Egypt's claimed victories materialized into actual Egyptian advances, then perhaps Jerusalem could remain in Arab hands. The battle for Jerusalem began in earnest on the night of June 5th. Israeli paratroopers under the command of Colonel Mordecai Gur moved into the northern neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, fighting house to house through the darkness. The combat was intimate and vicious, conducted at ranges measured in meters, sometimes in centimeters. Defenders fired from windows and rooftops. Attackers used Bangalore torpedoes to breach walls, grenades to clear rooms. The narrow streets of the Old City amplified every explosion, every burst of automatic fire. But while the world's attention focused on Jerusalem, the decisive battles were being fought in the Sinai desert. Egyptian forces there, stripped of air cover and increasingly cut off from central command by Israeli airstrikes that had destroyed communication nodes, found themselves facing Israeli armored columns that moved with terrifying speed and aggression. Major General Ariel Sharon commanded one of these columns, a division of tanks and mechanized infantry tasked with breaking through Egyptian defensive positions at Abu-Ageila, a fortified complex that blocked one of the main routes through the Sinai. The Egyptians had built formidable defenses there, 3 lines of trenches protected by minefields, barbed wire, and mutually supporting bunker positions. Soviet advisors had designed the fortification based on lessons from World War II, creating what they believed was an impregnable position. Sharon studied the defenses and decided that a conventional frontal assault would be suicidal. Instead, he designed a complex attack that would come from multiple directions simultaneously. While Israeli artillery pounded the Egyptian positions from the front, creating the impression of an imminent frontal assault, Sharon sent infantry units on a long flanking march through the desert to attack the Egyptian artillery positions from the rear. At the same time, paratroopers were helicoptered in to block Egyptian reinforcements. The attack began after dark on June 5th. Egyptian gunners, accustomed to Soviet doctrine that emphasized massed artillery fire from protected positions, suddenly found themselves under attack from their own rear by Israeli infantry that had infiltrated through supposedly impassable desert terrain. Coordination between Egyptian units broke down. Communication lines, already damaged by earlier airstrikes, failed completely. By dawn on June 6th, Abu-Ageila had fallen, and the road through the Sinai lay open. Other Israeli commanders showed similar initiative and aggression. Major General Avraham Yaffe, commanding a reserve division of tanks, took his forces through terrain that Egyptian planners had deemed impassable for armor. Sandy wastes where tanks would supposedly bog down. Yaffe's tanks did bog down repeatedly, but his men dismounted and pushed and dragged their vehicles through, refusing to accept the limitations that terrain imposed. They emerged on the roads behind Egyptian defensive lines, cutting off retreat routes, sowing chaos in Egyptian rear areas. The Egyptian plan, such as it was, had been predicated on a methodical defense in depth, on using prepared positions to bleed the Israeli advance, on air power to disrupt Israeli logistics, on the Sinai's vast distances to slow Israeli momentum. But the Israeli Air Force's destruction of Egyptian air power had eliminated one pillar of that plan. The speed and unconventional routing of Israeli armored columns had bypassed the prepared defensive positions, and Egyptian command and control, never robust, collapsed under the strain of simultaneous attacks and the loss of communication infrastructure. By the evening of June 6th, Egyptian forces in the Sinai were in full retreat. Orders from Cairo were contradictory or non-existent. Individual commanders made independent decisions to fall back, to try to reach the Suez Canal before Israeli forces cut them off. What had been an organized defensive force was becoming a stampede of desperate men and vehicles racing westward across the desert.
Israeli pilots, having eliminated the Egyptian Air Force as a threat, turned their attention to this fleeing column. The Mitla Pass, one of the main routes through the mountains that separated the Sinai from the Suez Canal, became a killing ground. Hundreds of vehicles, tanks, trucks, armored personnel carriers jammed into the narrow pass, unable to maneuver, unable to disperse. Israeli aircraft made pass after pass, dropping bombs and firing rockets into the congested mass of metal and men. The destruction was apocalyptic. Survivors would later describe the pass as resembling biblical hell, burning vehicles lighting the desert night, the smell of diesel and burning flesh, the screams of trapped men. In Gaza, the small Egyptian garrison found itself isolated. The territory had been under Egyptian administration since 1948, home to hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees from Israel's War of Independence. Now it was being bypassed by Israeli forces racing toward the Suez. An Israeli brigade moved in on June 6th, meeting limited resistance. By June 7th, Gaza and the entire Gaza Strip were under Israeli control. The West Bank was collapsing just as rapidly. Jordanian forces, fighting with courage and skill, found themselves overwhelmed by Israeli air superiority and armored mobility. The battle for Jenin lasted less than a day. Israeli forces cut the main road between Nablus and the Jordan River, trapping Jordanian units in the northern West Bank. In the south, Israeli forces pushed east from Jerusalem toward Jericho, cutting off the southern West Bank.
On the morning of June 7th, Israeli paratroopers approached the Old City of Jerusalem. Colonel Gur's forces had fought their way through East Jerusalem's northern neighborhoods, taking heavy casualties but maintaining momentum. Now they faced the walls of the Old City itself, the ancient limestone barriers that had been fought over for millennia. The Jordanian defenders inside were running low on ammunition, cut off from resupply, but they were determined to make the Israelis pay for every meter. The Israelis entered through St. Stephen's Gate, also known as the Lion's Gate, on the eastern wall. Fighting was intense in the narrow alleys of the Muslim quarter. Defenders fired from rooftops and windows. Israeli soldiers moved in small teams, supporting each other, clearing buildings room by room. Progress was measured in buildings, in alleyways, in sections of stone wall. By mid-morning, Israeli forces reached the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism and the third holiest in Islam, home to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. The moment was electric with historical weight. Israeli soldiers, many of them secular kibbutzniks who had never been particularly religious, found themselves weeping as they reached the Western Wall, the retaining wall of the ancient Jewish temple, a site from which Jews had been barred for 19 years under Jordanian rule. Defense Minister Dayan arrived at the Western Wall hours later, making his way through the still dangerous streets to what had become the symbolic heart of the Israeli victory. He understood the power of images, the importance of this moment. "We have returned to our holiest of holy places," he said to the assembled soldiers and journalists, "never to be parted from it again." It was rhetoric, but it was also strategy. Dayan knew that holding Jerusalem would be politically essential to any post-war settlement. But even as Jerusalem fell, the war's focus was shifting north. Syria had been shelling Israeli settlements in the Galilee from the commanding heights of the Golan for years. The fortified Syrian positions there, built with Soviet assistance, were formidable. Bunkers carved into basalt rock, overlapping fields of fire, minefields, barbed wire. The terrain favored defense. The slopes were steep, the approaches exposed. Syrian artillery could range every possible avenue of attack. Israeli Northern Command had been urging an attack on the Golan since the war began, but Eshkol and Dayan had hesitated. Taking the Golan would be costly, and there were concerns about Soviet reaction if Israel attacked Syria, the Soviet Union's closest ally in the region. But as the fighting in the Sinai and West Bank wound down, pressure mounted to do something about the Syrian positions that had been terrorizing Israeli farmers for so long. On the morning of June 9th, Israeli forces began the assault on the Golan Heights. The attack combined infantry, armor, and close air support in a coordinated effort to overwhelm Syrian defenses through multiple simultaneous breaches. Israeli combat engineers used Bangalore torpedoes and demolition charges to clear paths through minefields while under intense fire.
Tanks attacked uphill, their gun barrels elevated to maximum depression to hit bunker firing slits. Infantry fought bunker to bunker, using grenades and satchel charges to destroy Syrian positions. The fighting was savage. Syrian defenders, dug into positions they had spent years fortifying, fought with determination. They knew that giving ground on the Golan meant exposing Syrian territory itself to Israeli attack. But Israeli forces, veterans now of 4 days of continuous combat, pressed forward with relentless aggression. They had learned that hesitation in this war meant casualties, that momentum was everything. By the afternoon of June 9th, the first Israeli units had broken through the Syrian first defensive line. By evening, Syrian command was reporting to Damascus that the line was collapsing. During the night, in what would later be a source of enormous controversy, Syrian commanders began ordering retreats from positions that were still defensible. Whether this was due to confusion, to exaggerated reports of Israeli penetration, or to deliberate orders from Damascus remains disputed. What is certain is that by the morning of June 10th, Syrian forces were in full retreat from the Golan, abandoning positions and equipment. Israeli forces pursued, taking town after town in the Golan. Quneitra, the regional capital, fell without a fight, Syrian forces having fled hours before. Israeli tanks reached positions from which they could see Damascus, less than 40 miles away, shimmering in the distance across the plain. At this point, the Soviet Union intervened diplomatically with unprecedented force. The Soviets had been caught completely off guard by the speed and totality of the Arab defeat. Their clients, armed with Soviet weapons and trained in Soviet doctrine, had been crushed in less than a week. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin used the hotline to Washington to demand an immediate ceasefire, hinting at possible Soviet military intervention if Israel attacked Syria, the Soviet Union's closest ally in the region. But as the fighting in the Sinai and West Bank wound down, pressure mounted to do something about the Syrian positions that had been terrorizing Israeli farmers for so long. On the morning of June 10th, 1967, the guns fell silent. 6 days after it began, the Six-Day War was over. The map of the Middle East had been redrawn. Israel now controlled the Sinai Peninsula, an area of over 60,000 square kilometers that tripled its effective size. It controlled the Gaza Strip, with its refugee population. It controlled the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and sites of profound religious significance to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It controlled the Golan Heights, the high ground that had menaced its northern settlements. The human cost had been significant but asymmetric. Israel had lost approximately 800 soldiers killed and 2,500 wounded. Arab casualties were far higher. Egypt alone had lost over 10,000 soldiers killed, with thousands more captured. Jordan had lost approximately 700 killed. Syria's casualties were in the thousands. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been captured, entire divisions destroyed or disbanded.
But beyond the military statistics, the war had created new realities that would shape the region for decades. Approximately 300,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from the West Bank during the fighting, many crossing the Jordan River into Jordan proper. These new refugees joined the hundreds of thousands already displaced by the 1948 war, creating a Palestinian diaspora that would become increasingly radicalized. For Palestinians living in the newly occupied territories, the war marked the beginning of a military occupation that continues to this day. In the West Bank, Israeli military administrators took control of civil governance. Movement was restricted. Palestinian institutions were subordinated to Israeli military authority. In Gaza, Egyptian administrators left, replaced by Israeli military governors who found themselves governing one of the most densely populated and impoverished areas on earth. The speed of Israel's victory had profound psychological effects throughout the Arab world. The rhetoric before the war had been of inevitable victory, of liberation, of the destruction of Israel. Instead, what came was catastrophic defeat, the exposure of military and political weakness, the humiliation of having armies that had seemed powerful revealed as hollow. This psychological blow would fuel radicalization,
would contribute to the rise of militant groups that rejected the conventional military approaches that had failed so spectacularly. In Israel, the victory produced euphoria mixed with unexpected dilemmas. The military triumph was undeniable, but what to do with the territories now under Israeli control was far from clear. Some Israelis argued for trading land for peace, for using the captured territories as bargaining chips in negotiations. Others saw divine providence in the conquest of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Biblical Judea and Samaria returned to Jewish control. Religious settlers began moving into the West Bank almost immediately, establishing facts on the ground that would complicate any future peace negotiations. Moshe Dayan, the man whose strategic vision had shaped the war's opening hours, found himself appointed as Minister of Defense in the occupation. He implemented what he called an open bridges policy with Jordan, allowing some movement of goods and people across the Jordan River, trying to make the occupation more palatable. But he also authorized the beginning of settlement construction, understanding that physical presence would create political leverage. The war had demonstrated the effectiveness of preemptive military action, of striking first when war seemed inevitable, of destroying enemy capabilities before they could be deployed. This doctrine would shape Israeli strategic thinking for generations, but it had also demonstrated the limits of military victory. Israel had won decisively on every front, had destroyed or routed every army it faced, had taken territory that gave it strategic depth and defensible borders. Yet it was no more secure than before. The conflict had not ended. It had merely entered a new phase. In the decades that followed, the territories captured in those 6 days would become the central issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Sinai would eventually be returned to Egypt as part of the Camp David Accords in 1979, demonstrating that land for peace was possible. But the West Bank and Gaza would remain under Israeli control, subject to military occupation, settlement expansion, and periodic waves of violence. The 6-day war showed that brilliant military strategy, superior training, technological advantage, and audacious leadership could deliver stunning tactical victories. Israeli commanders had outthought and outfought their opponents at every level, from Dayan's strategic vision to Sharon's operational creativity to the skill of individual tank commanders and fighter pilots. The war would be studied in military academies worldwide as a case study in successful offensive operations. But it also showed that military victory alone could not resolve fundamental political conflicts. The Palestinians who came under Israeli occupation did not disappear. The Arab states defeated in the war did not accept permanent Israeli control of captured territories. The international community did not recognize Israeli annexation of conquered lands. UN Security Council Resolution 242, passed in November 1967, called for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the conflict, though the deliberately ambiguous wording left room for interpretation about whether this meant all territories or just some. The speed and completeness of the victory had been intoxicating, had created a sense of Israeli military invincibility that would persist until it was shattered by the surprise Arab attack in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. But in those 6 days of June 1967, commanders had indeed reshaped the Middle East, had redrawn borders, and created realities that would define the region's conflicts for the next half-century and beyond. In less than a week, the modern Middle East had been born, with all its contradictions and conflicts, its military victories and unsolved political crises, its captured territories and displaced populations. The war had showed what military force could accomplish and what it could not, what brilliant commanders could achieve on the battlefield, and what remained beyond the reach of even the most decisive military victory.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.